with you.
And also with you.
Let's start out with a prayer this morning. Gracious, giving, loving God, we thank you for your presence here with us today and every day. We ask you to give us confidence and commitment to express your word to those around us. Help us to find that confidence when we see others. Thank you for this challenge that you give us in spreading your word in our community. Be with us throughout the week as we find those opportunities. In your son's name we pray. Amen. So good morning to all of you. Those that don't know me, my name is Don McCracken, and I was just sharing a story. On Friday night, I got a text from Bill. I couldn't quite figure it out, and it was late, and I didn't get a response. And then yesterday, there was a little bit of phone tag, and at about noon, I got a call from Bill, text, and then a call. And I said, "Aren't you on your way to Germany?" And he said, "Well, we're at the airport, and I have a favor to ask of you." And I said, of course, being Bill, I said, "Sure, I'll do that." And, sorry, I'm not in the camera, I'm not used to this. I said, "Sure, I'll do that." And at that time, his phone died. So yesterday at noon, I had no idea. I waited for 2 hours. They left at 2:30. Tracked the flight. They were up over Baffin Island someplace. And then at about 8 o'clock last night, I got a text from him. So the magic of electronics, I'm sure they were up over Greenland somewhere. He sent me a text to try and get this running. Not a big deal. So here's the deal. The video today are the two authors of this book that Bill's been referring to. And he's actually done some study in some other books as well, he mentioned. But he wanted to show us this. It's actually, this is one half of the way through. It'll start just a second here. It's about 45 minutes. It's in a large Episcopal congregation church with a Episcopal bishop. That's part of this setup. Bill asked me to tell you that the first half of this is a bit of a review of what we've been going through in the class over the last, 3 or 4 weeks. The second half is a little more interesting on what we, as a congregation, may be able to do with the information we're getting. While we watch it, I think it might be helpful. These are 2 questions that he put forward. What new information did you hear today that you haven't heard so far in the class? So just keep that in mind while you're listening, or jot notes to yourselves. And then the second question was, what do you think most relates to our context at SLC? So at the end of this, the question I was jokingly going to say, well, he asked me to put up have a conversation about the meaning of life. Something simple, but it's actually just watching the video. And at the end, I'll just facilitate some discussion. Anyone who wants to talk or share what they've learned from this. Bill's back in 2 weeks, and as he mentioned, there will be a little bit of a close on what we're doing with this class. So I hope we all get something out of it. That's it. That's all I have for now. Wish them well if they're watching in Berlin right now. Hi, Bill. Hope I didn't screw it up. So can you back it up to about 48? Just, 48. Hang on 1 second. 43. Yeah, 43.
Shed certain miracles to be able to relate to the culture more. Our study shows the more churches hold on to the historic Nicene Creed Christianity, including miracles, the better they're going to do from a data point of view. All right, so let me give you some of the high-level insights that we learned. Now that we have those categories, de-church people are not monolithic. I've said already that we are currently in the largest and fastest religious shift in the history of the United States. That's a big deal. And I would argue Christians and non-Christians alike should care about that. As a pastor, I care about it because, as Justin said in the beginning, these are people, these are souls. Even the Christians who are no longer attending church, the reality is that the children of the de-churched will most likely be unchurched. And as a pastor, I care about that. But even my agnostic and atheist friends should care about the impact this is going to have on the culture in which we live. The GDP of all of the people who have left church, the 40 million, is about $1.4 trillion. So if you take the national giving average of 2.5% and you apply it to that 40 million group of 40 million people, about $24 billion a year is leaving the church. And so when you think also about the fact that 40% of the social safety net in our country comes from churches and religious nonprofits, this is going to make a big difference, because even though some of the de-churched people are still giving to those institutions, the likelihood that their children and grandchildren will is pretty low. So, Christian or not, this is going to affect a lot of the world that we live in, and we would also argue is going to contribute to the fracturing and polarizing of the political conversations that we're having. Second, we've said this, over half of the people who have de-churched are actively willing to return. That was a big shocker to us. We didn't realize how many people would still be willing to return. Number 3, this is very interesting. Education and de-churching are inversely related. You often hear things like, well, Christianity is a poor man's religion. The poorer you are, the more likely you are to believe, and once we get educated and make money, we move on. Our study, and our study is not the only one, but our study does prove the more educated a Christian is, especially in the evangelical space, the more likely they are to stay in church. So only 3% of evangelicals with a master's degree have de-churched. 3%. So this kind of this goes after the myth of the boogeyman of higher secular education taking our children away. 4, going to college students and education. College students, Christian college students who are involved in a church and a campus ministry, they are 3 times likely to continue in the church. 5th, the overwhelming majority of people who de-church will do so between the ages of 13 and 30. So this is a big deal. That is the time frame where it is most difficult to maintain your faith. In the BIPOC evangelical group, that it was even harder during the ages of 13 to 30. It's hard for everybody, but you have 3 specific stages there. You have your teenage years, which are hard. You have your transition out of your parents' home into college or vocation. That's a hard season to maintain your faith. And then right after that, if you go to college, establishing your professional life, getting married, that season is the hardest season. And so there are implications. We'll talk about a little bit about that. And then 6, coming back to the education discrepancy, de-churching is largely a middle, low class, and low class phenomenon. Now, this is very important for the church to hear. The top reasons for people de-churching: I moved and life transitions. So who gets hit hardest when there's a divorce? When kids come, expected or unexpected? Who gets hit hardest when you lose a job? Well, the lower class gets hit the hardest. Then that requires working longer, unusual hours. It requires more transition in some cases when there are custody issues. So de-churching is the life issues that contribute to de-churching are hitting the lower class more significantly. And so we argue that there are some things that the church needs to do to be thinking about the middle to low class and the low class to be able to engage and minister to them more effectively. This is a really interesting, and for some people, an alarming insight. Evangelicals are de-churching today on the secular right at twice the speed of the secular left. Wow. So here's another myth. A myth you hear is it's the secular left that's de-churching. Well, currently, the secular right is de-churching at twice the pace. Now, some of that is because a lot of de-churching has already happened on the secular left. But in terms of numbers, the secular right is almost caught up. So that goes against a lot of what we understand about the de-churched person. And we're going to have some discussion time, and we can dive in with Justin in a number of these areas, but we want to highlight some of these higher findings. So we spend largely the latter half of the book, latter 40%, talking about what are some things that we as a church can do given this data. Now, as an Orthodox Christian, I want to introduce caveats that the Bible gives us, like we believe the Holy Spirit needs to do something. The Holy Spirit opens our eyes. We know the end of the story. So I want to put those caveats there. But as people, we're still called to exercise wisdom. And so there's some wisdom that can be gleaned from this data. The first thing is that we, as church leaders, and I'm talking about us, we need to exercise more relational wisdom. And it's not just for church leaders. I think in some places it starts there. But exercise relational wisdom, humility, skills of curiously listening. Justin and I have talked about, if you know the term apologetics, defending the Christian faith, the apologetic of the 21st century, one of the main apologetics are going to be skills that look a lot like a counselor. So exercising that kind of relational wisdom. Invest in student ministry. If 13 to 30 is the hardest time to maintain your faith, then we as a church need to make big investments there. We need to be spaces where a child can feel comfortable having doubt and asking people about that doubt. We need to be a place where we are grounding what we believe and teaching it in a way where it's sending them out into the world in a way where they know how to live in that world. So that's going to mean, it can mean a lot of things in different contexts, but we want to invest in that generation. We want to give them space to ask questions. We want to give them real answers for the questions that they're asking in high school and in transition out of their parents' house. Third, prioritize mental health. As Mike said, there's a lot of data that says that those who have those who regularly attend church, they do find themselves in a better mental space than those who do not. But that doesn't mean that we've got the market on mental health. So we need to recognize that and continue to build. And Orlando is unique because we have the largest per capita number of mental health professionals of any city in the world.
Wow.
There are 11 institutions in Central Florida pumping out mental health degrees.
Wow.
So we have a lot of resources at our disposal. Now, we want to filter through some of those resources, but we have a lot of resources to take advantage of. Connecting to that, as a church, we want to lean into a holistic gospel. Mike referenced the phrase, a gospel that is true, good, and beautiful. In the evangelical space, which I come from, in the 20th century, we put an emphasis on what is true. And you saw this in our sermons, in our apologetic methods, in our evangelistic tracts. What's true, true, true. And that often came at the expense of, is it good? Is it beautiful? So now, fast forward to now, what kind of questions and opposition do we as Christians get? Is it ethical? Is it good? So that shouldn't surprise us. We would argue that the Bible and Jesus' gospel is true, it is good, and it is beautiful. You go over to the mainline space, and there was a different shift. There was a strong emphasis on what is good in society, sometimes among the de-churched mainline people, sometimes at the expense of what is true. So we as a church, whatever stream of the Christian faith we come from, we want to embrace a gospel that is true, that is good, and is beautiful, because that is what we are given. 5, this may be one of the more uncomfortable takeaways. Christians need to be willing to embrace an exilic posture. The norm for God's people over the history of the church, and when I say the church, I'm going back to Israel, Abraham, Jeremiah, in the early church in the New Testament, moving on in other areas of the world, the norm for God's people has been a state of exile. That's true today in the East, the global East, and the global South. So we need to know that what we've experienced over the past 150 years, while there are blessings in it, has not been the norm for God's people. And we need to be okay and know that God has been with his people and met them in exile, and we're no different. 6, identify a de-churched mainstream evangelical and invite them back to church. This is the lowest hanging fruit. And you don't have to be in an evangelical church to do this. We're just saying there's this group of 2.5 million people who are 100% willing to come back. We handed a lot of the money for our study came out of one church in Missouri, Columbia, Missouri, and we gave them our executive report very early on, said, here's the data, do what you want with it. They saw this group, what eventually became called the de-church mainstream evangelical group. They identified this group both digitally and personally, And in 4 months, they had hundreds of new people in their church. Hundreds. I want to go back to what Justin said. It's really important. This isn't just to fill up a church or fill up coffers or something. The children of the D church will likely, sociologically speaking, be unchurched. So this isn't just an investment in the current status of our local church. This is an investment in generations. And then lastly, we as a church coming back to de-churching being a lower class phenomenon. Maybe a better way to say that is it's hitting the lower class harder. It's hitting them harder. We as a church need to think about what we can do to minister and encourage people for whom life transitions hit harder than they do many of us. So, with that said, we believe it or not, that was a high-level walkthrough. we can get much more granular, but we wanted to have some time where we have Justin come up, and I know he to be able to have a discussion and go in different directions, double-click on certain things. So that's what we wanted to do. Now, Bishop, would you join us?
You guys have a copy?
I do have a copy.
So thank you for the opportunity to join in on this discussion. Just a few things before I get to some questions that I have. First, I read the book. I endorsed it. That was fascinating. To be able to have the whole book in 45 minutes like that. Absolutely fascinating. But even more important to me was I could hear the tone of your hearts in that. I love the fact that brilliant pastors are informing us and with that put together. So thank you, because when you start talking about the spreadsheet, I'm imagining you, because I've referred to you as a calculator with a heart. And we're friends. I'm imagining you sitting there looking at that spreadsheet and your heart being broken. And I'm really grateful for that. And you also dismantled some of the assumptions that people have about what de-churched are, and that's what was so helpful for me reading through the book. But let's get started on. So what was surprising, you just said it toward the end, is that education and de-churching seem to be inverse, and especially among evangelicals. So can you unpack that a little bit more about the de-churching education inversion?
Yeah, this was something that was really interesting to us. Our social scientist, the primary one, Dr. Ryan Burge, he's done some work in this area. He himself was surprised at how clearly it presented itself in this area, with 3% of evangelicals who have master's degrees have de-churched. So we know that to be a fact. Why is that? There's educated guessing going on, and there's more studies that should be done on this. There's some social theories that the type of person who wants to go to the university, wants to then get a master's degree, is the type of person, for a variety of reasons, who would want to find themselves in a community of thinkers on a mission. So there's a social piece to that. Others, and I'm not disregarding that, others like myself would also say Christianity is a thinking man's religion, that we are given a faith that makes sense. Even there are some things, miracles, that we can't explain. There's some paradoxes like the Trinity and Jesus being fully man and fully God. Can't explain that. We get to a point where we run into heresy. We have to engage the paradox. But largely, this story makes sense. There's historical evidence. There's scientific evidence. There's archaeological evidence. And so there is something about the legitimacy of the Christian story and the Christian faith handed down to us, the historicity of the Bible, that
You just pointed to your book and said Bible as well.
Yeah, I'm assuming there's a Bible somewhere over there, Justin. So there is a piece where education and Christianity are they do go together. They coexist. You don't have to turn your brain off.
Yeah, that was another dismantling of an assumption that some people would have. Another one is, you said secular right is de-churching at twice the rate of secular left. So I just want to highlight that, but to what do you attribute that historically and in the present time?
Okay, so I'm going to try and do this fast, but I think it's very interesting to see the progression of the era that we're calling the Great Dechurching. And again, we call it the Great Dechurching because it's not the Great Unchristianing or something. You know, it's not the Great Deconversion, because a lot of these people are still Christians. The Great Dechurching really started in the 1990s. There are 4 reasons that this is true. First, the fall of the Soviet Union. This was a major piece to contributing to the Great Dechurching, because before the end of the Cold War, to be Christian and to be American were synonymous. So some of you are of an age, I can remember this as a child, when somebody during the Cold War, that era, would say, I'm no longer a Christian, it wasn't crazy for the next question to be, well, are you a communist? I mean, that jump wasn't crazy back then. Now, if to a younger person that might sound like a crazy jump, but it wasn't. It was during the Cold War in the Eisenhower administration when In God We Trust was added to our money, when Under God was added to our pledge. That's not by chance. That Christian America was at odds, was in conflict with evil communists. So, fall of the Soviet Union, you could, for the first time, be an American and not a Christian. Then you have the rise of the internet. 1994, you have internet cafes coming up. You have internet by 97 in which the schools and libraries. So not only was there freedom to not be a Christian in our society at large, you might still not feel the freedom in your family groups and social groups, but you could find like-minded people online. You could find other worldviews online. Then there was some, with the rise of the religious right, Pat Robertson, there were some expressions on the secular and political right of Christianity that some people that were more left-leaning felt like, well, if that's what Christianity is, I don't want any part of it. Now, largely, some of these people are probably not Christians anyway and looking for reasons to not be. But then finish the decade, September 11th, 2001. And one day, America's enemies go from the evil communist atheists to religious fundamentalists. And so then there's a whole other group of people that just at the very least, uses that as an excuse to not want anything to do with what they perceive to be fundamental religion. And so in that series of the 90s is when the secular left began to de-church. Roman Catholic, mainline. But as we progressed through the early 2000s, the 20-teens into where we are now, you see the secular right catching up. Some of that is because there are fewer secular left people to de-churched. But there is a real phenomenon. There's a type of person, when I talk about embracing an exilic posture, there's a fear that is growing among the average Christian American about what's going on in our country. And so, anybody has their primary, secondary, and tertiary beliefs. The primary, the most important, and we go down in order. Well, as a Christian, we care about the country and what's going on, but primary things are going to be the doctrines that we're talking about. And there should be a trust that God's going to take care of his people, whatever our culture looks like. But increasingly on the secular right, there is a type of person who looks around, and their primary belief has more to do with country or God and country. And that person is going to look around most churches and feel like, well, that's not everybody else's primary thing. And that's what they want to hear more of from the pulpit, from the congregation, in small groups. And so some of those people are looking and finding other groups with whom they can share that primary motivation. And they're going to get some church-like sentiments, like community and mission, but it's not going to be the church.
Thank you. Michael, you were doing the data, so I'm giving you this question, so I'm curious. And you wrote the book, Ethnicity Casts a Long Shadow in the Data. And so I'm asking you to unpack that, but also what are the implications of that reality? Ethnicity casts a long shadow in the data.
So when Jim and I were talking with one of our two social scientists, Ryan Burge, this is the phrase that he used. Ethnicity casts a long shadow in the data. So we asked him the same question, like, Ryan, what does this mean? And what Ryan meant by that is that even though our algorithm didn't have the ability to see ethnicity, it's still sorted largely along ethnic lines. Cultural Christians, 98% white. The mainstream de-churched evangelicals, 91% white. The ex-evangelicals, 83% white. And then the BIPOC group, 0% white. Okay, well, how do you account for the algorithm sorting what looks like based on ethnicity when it didn't have the ability to even see ethnicity? So, what Ryan, when we were talking with him, is ethnicity definitely shapes people and forms them in significant ways, in ways that we might not even be, that might be subconscious or even unconscious in terms of how we're formed and shaped. And there's, I don't think it shouldn't be a shocking revelation, in this day and age to say that there's not like necessarily one America. There are many different Americas. And, ethnicity is one of the things that's going to play into how the perspective that you have on any number of things. Culture, society, the institutions that we see and experience. And so ethnicity is a very important category when it comes to de-churching. And certainly, perhaps, maybe even the most important category in terms of reasons why people left and reasons why they would be willing to return. So it's something that we should not ignore when we're thinking about engaging with de-churched persons.
Thank you. So what do you make of the 1 million affluent black men who left the church in the late 90s?
I'm not sure I can think of a group of people who are more interesting to me than this subset of the 1 million, extremely affluent black men who left in the late 1990s. I'm not really sure, by and large, what to make of this group. When we were, just kind of developing stories and narrative around this group of people, it was not the easiest group to just kind of to tell a story about. But you're talking about the kind of, a Colin Powell type, somebody who's, very high achieving and, very much advancing in culture and society, can navigate various differences in socioeconomic spaces with deafness, but yet is experiencing what looks to be significant friction relationally and maybe even institutionally in evangelical churches. Now, their story was a mixture of casual and casualty reasons. There's certainly relational friction, institutional friction, but there's also seems to be a fair amount of apathy that was there as well. So, when you do stuff like this, I got a whole other document of like 20 different areas. If I ever do additional research where I want more granularity, I want to know more about this group of people because I'm really curious.
So you started, and either one of you started out talking about the history of Metro Orlando area. And while your book you said it started about Metro Orlando, but then it turned into much larger, national, and what's happening. Going back to Metro Orlando, can you define Metro Orlando? How many counties is that? And what percentage of the de-church? And you may have mentioned that, but I just want to...
I don't think I said the exact percentage. So the Metro Orlando area is the same area that the FCC, the radio demographic, 7 counties. It's Orlando, Melbourne, Daytona. And according to the Barna 2017 study, that area was 6%, fact check me here, Mike, but 6% evangelical and 42% de-churched, which means that about 2 million people in that area used to go to church and no longer do.
That's the Diocese of Central Florida is 14. 7 of those, that's half of the diocese, and there's the Central Florida Presbytery, it's about the same size. So just highlighting about 2 million. That's a significant percentage of the de-church for one metro area.
Yeah, so if you consider just, that there's 40 million people who have de-churched overall, and 2 million of them are in our metro area, that means 1 in 20 de-churched people in America are in our metro base. So this is our backyard.
That makes us the 6th sixth largest de-churched city in the United States, which means the world, because this is an American phenomenon right now.
Jim, you mentioned that there was a previous shift that was after the Civil War, and we often hear that our country is founded as a Christian country. So what you're saying is that there were a lot of people before and during the Civil War who didn't go to church. Am I hearing you right? And if so, can you say a little bit more?
Yeah, there was the United States a Christian nation at its founding? That's a very loaded question.
That's why I asked it, and then we'll try to answer it all.
Yeah. But it's a good question, and it's a necessary question to understand what's going on here. In 1776, according to Stark and Fink, 17% of the people in the United States went to church regularly. So 17%. That's not a very large percent. Now that grew through the Second Great Awakening to about 34% right before the Civil War. But I think there's something that we have to understand, and I feel like I need to lead off by saying I'm pro-United States and pro-Constitution. But the single, let me phrase it like this. The Constitution of the United States was the single watershed document into secularization in the West. And I make that argument by saying, if you compare it to the colonies, to the Constitution of the colonies, let's just say Connecticut, they talk about Jesus. They talk about evangelism. Now, there was an asserted effort in the U.S. Constitution to pull some of that out. Now, you know, there's some good in that. They wanted a nation for all types of people, and I appreciate that. I'm not really taking any shots at the Constitution, just saying that the rise in Christianity, the way that we and our parents and grandparents have experienced it, was largely a 20th century phenomenon. And so that's why we began to see this boom after the Civil War of people who, there was some returning to church, but a lot of people who had never gone to church because only 34% of the nation went to church regularly before the Civil War. And you have to think a national tragedy like that would stir up some of the deeper questions in our lives.
The peak churching of America was in the 1970s. That's
The
high water mark.
I love it. I love the peak churching of America.
High water mark.
Great phrase.
70%. So you have 4 times the percentage of American citizens in church in the 1970s than what you did at our nation's founding in 1776. Now, we trailed off from that, and a couple of years back, we dipped below 50%. And so now more people don't go to church than go to church. That's a significant shift, and we haven't been there for quite some time. However, it is a bit of a misnomer to think that, we have to get into kind of mythological territory to begin to really kind of take 1776 and that era in our country and kind of make it be the Andy Mayberry, kind of mentality.
So Jim and then Mike, you gave us some bad news about people, how they're suffering, some of the simple ways of moving. Despite the bad news, you both in the book, but also this evening, have communicated hope. And I would like to hear more, Jim, on the hope you have despite the bad news of your research.
Well, a lot. To begin with, the truth is our friend. And so as a church, we want to know the truth about the areas that we live in. And so the more we work through this, I'm hopeful for how many people really seem to still be Christians. I'm hopeful in the willingness of 51% of the 40 million being willing to come back. I also see a real opportunity, and I would even say a window of opportunity, because the great de-churching is going to end one way or another. Whether everybody de-churched and there's nobody left to de-church, or if it's reversed or stabilized in some way. But either way, this window is going to close, and we have an opportunity to invest and reach people who already have a Christian foundation. I've been a missionary in other parts of the world where there's zero biblical foundation. There's a whole other level of work to do when people have no foundation at all. I'm saying we have an opportunity here and now to invest in people who already have that foundation. And it's not just an investment in them, it's an investment in generations to come in this country, because these people have children and grandchildren. And I would argue, so go the people today on this issue, so go the generations to come.
My hope is twofold, and Jim mentioned this before. I believe in a God who's good and in control. And I believe in a God who also uses us and whose sovereignty works together with our agency. And so when I'm looking at all of the reasons why people left church, it seems reasonable.
Yeah.
I understand why. And when I can just zoom out, demystify why people left, I mean, the reasons make a lot of sense. You know, there's relational friction interpersonally, and then there's friction institutionally. Well, and then when I look at all the reasons why people said that they would be willing to return, they look like things that are in my control in terms of how I relate to you, and they look like things in terms of the institutional way. Well, we can do church better.
And they're reasonable things
They're
that
reasonable.
the church should be able to provide.
They're reasonable things. So it's like, well, when I look at, when we zoom out, we demystify what's going on. We look at the reasons why people would be willing to return. Well, we grow as people. We grow as, church institutions. We learn from what we're hearing. And, by God's grace and through sanctification, we do better. So I have tremendous hope.
I have one more question that's practically oriented, but I want to see, because when you're up here, we're talking about all of this, if there's anything you left out, anything that you want to mention, because you've given us a lot, but anything that's swirling around of like, oh, I got to make sure I say this. So I know it's a curveball, but I just want to throw it open to you for a moment. Is there any theme, any topic, any question that you want to address before our final question?
We've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
Anything that we haven't addressed?
Okay.
I think we've covered a lot. I just want to drill more into different things, but there's no major topic of our study that we've not touched on.
I wanted to leave it wide open for you to make sure you had all the bases covered. So last question, and whoever wants to go first, but I want to hear from both of you, is and you started to talk about this at the very end, what is one most impactful, lowest hanging fruit, practical thing people can do to respond to the data and what you're telling us?
So I'm going to cheat a little bit. I've already said, identify a D-Church mainstream evangelical, invite them. So I get to have another one.
You do.
I'm going to give a very Orlando answer. I think about a month ago, we're the third fastest growing city in the United States of America. Well, what's the number one reason for de-churching? Moving. Well, I want to mobilize our moving first responders, school administrators, realtors, people who can identify people when they move. And if these people are Christians and looking for a church, they can have a major impact in connecting them so they don't become one of the casually de-churched.
Right.
For me, it's the growth that we have as individuals. You might not be in a place where you can affect institutional change in, say, a local church. You might not have any position of leadership, these different kinds of things, but we can all grow as humans. And in the book, we kind of unpack this in a chapter entitled Relational Wisdom. And in that chapter, we talk about 6 key awarenesses that together, when you put them together, those things encompass relational wisdom. And I'll give them to you. You should buy the book, read the book. You can talk about this in much more detail. But those 6 key awarenesses are God awareness, self-awareness, others awareness, awareness of how other people experience you, cultural awareness, and emotional awareness.
Will you repeat those one more time? Because
Yeah.
people are taking notes on sitting with and watching people scribble notes.
Well, you won't have to take notes if you take because it's all there. But with God awareness, when we are sensitive to the triune work of God in our life, the Holy Spirit applying the work of Christ to us, to our whole being, we're sensitive to, Lord, who are you putting in front of me? And then when we have self-awareness, we have awareness of what is our story, what are our wants, fears, and desires, and hopes and dreams, all of those things together. And then when we have others' awareness, we're cognizant of the people that God just keeps putting consistently in front of us. You know, maybe they're nudge people, maybe they're dinner table people, or maybe they're people who need to be in our lives for years or decades, who knows. But then, and this is where I think people really struggle. And I know I struggle for it personally. I've had to go on a long journey for this myself. Marriage has been helpful, and ministry has been helpful, and friends have been helpful. Awareness of how other people are experiencing you. It's been a great struggle for me. And maybe, you know, if you're another spreadsheet guy, you can say a little amen in your, you know, in your soul. But how other people are experiencing this is really important. And those things can be bolstered if we are growing also in our emotional awareness and our cultural awareness as well. As we know, America's fracturing on significant levels. That's happening in the church. It's happening, you know, on Main Street as well. So the more that we can embody those 6 key awarenesses, people will experience us with greater relational trust, and they'll experience us in a way that, oh man, you know, Jim has something that's actually very attractive and magnetic to me. I'm kind of curious about those things. So a lot of these things just boil down to, you know, the ways in which we've made mistakes relationally with people at the individual level. And if you get a lot of people together who have a relational awareness, you know, who have relational wisdom, well, you end up with a church body that's going to do better as an institution. So I think that's the low-hanging fruit.
And once again, you've dismantled another huge barrier, because we all think, well, I mean, this room's packed because when they heard about de-churching, who's leaving, like, because they all have people in mind. We all have people in mind. So they're here, but the encouraging word to me, I could feel the hope when you all were describing it viscerally of inviting people. I don't have to go get another degree, or I need to find some leader who's going to do it. There's not some person I need to point to, but I can actually do something. There's people God put in my life who, and like when you start doing, you even leaned in, you're like, they can even nudge. Like this, how simple and encouraging that is, that the people who are reading this book, who are hearing this, that they are actually the ones that God is using for his kingdom, for his mission. So thank you for your friendship. I have a few closing announcements for all of us, but I just want to thank you both for your friendship, for the hard work, for raising $100,000 to do this, to take the hours and weeks and months, because I was alongside you guys as you were writing these things, and for pouring yourself out and focusing on this, and for your churches allowing you to give your attention to this, and your families who let you have the time to write this, because I know there were sacrifices there. So thank you very much. So for some... They were both looking at their wives that whole time of like, they really them to actually come up here and get some of the applause too, because I know them. So they're right down here. And thank you for letting me be a part of this, and for Cathedral Church of St. Luke to host this conversation and this discussion. So what you all need to know is that Michael and Jim will be next door. If you go out the back doors to the building next door, it's called the Great Hall, but you can't miss it because it's the only other building next door.
For those that want, I'll have a stack of the books outside. I make a little bit of money on the side. Sales pitch. No. For those that would like to review this or see it again, you can see it's a YouTube video that Bill sent to me, a link. So if you want to look it up on YouTube, the de-churching, you can find this and go through it again. He hits a lot of, they both hit a lot of interesting points. So I open it up to discussion. This can go on as long as we want. Bill said 15 minutes, but obviously if no one wants to talk, that's fine. But does anyone, we do have a mic runner, so if anyone wants to speak on what they heard or something that was brought to mind, anything new that came out that you hadn't heard before in the class? Joyce.
Thank you, Pete. One of the things.
A little closer. It's on.
One of the things.
Is it on?
I don't know.
It's on.
It's on. It's on.
Yeah, you're good. We can hear you. Yeah, we can hear.
hear me? Okay. One of the things that really caught my attention was the financial aspect. $24 million is ready to leave, you know, and we are a nonprofit and we do good things. So that just really amazes me.
Yeah.
And it's not, I mean, it's not good for our church,
Right.
for any church, I should say, yeah.
Right. One aspect of that I found interesting when he first started talking was it's the statistics are a little bit dry, and he started talking about it's how we analyze things, but how many people are de-churching and how much money they draw out of
Yeah.
that trillions of dollars, whatever it was, 1.4 trillion. But what's interesting to me, part of that was when he mentioned how much we do as a community for society. How many people come to church organizations, and it seems like the government is taking that aspect of what we do as a community, and people say, well, if I can contribute to Habitat for Humanity as an example, great organization, why do I need the church? Because we have other organizations who are filling the gap. And the question, of course, is, are they really filling the gap? But I found that interesting as well. Yeah. Others?
I also was interested in the money question in terms of socioeconomic, and that wealthier people are staying in church and lower income are the ones who are leaving the church. Personally, the people that I know who are low income are staying in the church, but it made me wonder about with the evangelical prosperity, there's another word for it, but the prosperity gospel. And I was wondering if that might have something to do with low income leaving the church because, well, obviously I'm not good enough if I'm not prosperous.
Yeah, that is an interesting question. Yeah. And that prosperity gospel and how that connects to that. I don't know. That's interesting. Yeah, Bill, go ahead.
Back in the late 1980s, I was on my second tour at the Pentagon with the Joint Staff, and one of my primary jobs was the U.S.-USSR Incidents at Sea Agreement. And in addition to any time an incident came up, we deal with it. But every year, one year we meet in Moscow, and one year we meet in D.C. And the first year I went over to Moscow, one of the things that surprised me was the people that were dealing with this on the Russian side took us to churches all over the place. They started with the one right in the Kremlin, and to other churches in the Moscow area. They even took us out to the monastery where the Russian Orthodox people were trained in their schooling. So they wanted us, I guess the whole United States, really to know that they were a Christian nation. That kind of surprised me.
That is interesting. Wow. Wow. And you also listen to people in China. I've read books on this where how the underground church grows when it's squashed by the government. So, anyone else? Other comments or questions? How does some of this apply? I wondered. These are Bill's questions about something new and then how it applies to SLC. And I wondered, in Orlando they were talking about how many people were moving in, what a growing area it is. And so their field is rich. We talk about our area being the least churched area. That's true, except we also have a very fluid environment of people moving in and out. So we also have this kind of dynamic of a floating, not like theirs where people are moving to Florida for a variety of reasons, politically or whatever, financially. But we have a floating de-churched community here. We can't quite tag them down. The people that come in that are bringing their past, but they're not getting engaged. They're the movers, the people that are moving, maybe only temporarily, and how do we tag them as well or get them involved? Any other questions? Comments? Yeah, Ann?
of find it daunting for people coming in, but our college students, it would be good to help them find a church in their area, a Lutheran or you know, maybe a little committee that takes all of the graduation kids and does a little search for them and give them a little care package as they go on their way.
I think all of this, the class that Bill gives, and Bill's a phenomenal teacher, and we're all drawn to that, but I also find it interesting to get the author's perspective and their speaking styles when they're talking and answering questions. I think, for a lot of us, the university, this is another aspect of the video that I found interesting, when they talk about education levels and how 3% of masters, people with master's degrees leave the church, how that changes. But for most of us, the university is what draws our kids out of Christianity, it seems like. We all wait for them to come back to some, my wife and I, actually, it's like you sometimes pray for some disaster to hit your children because you know that's going to bring them back in. They need that hope, and it's kind of an odd way to look at things, but I found that interesting, that how our universities affect our kids, that age 13 to 30 age bracket where people are, honestly, for me, it was a time of a lot of moving, and that's part of that. It's getting into a community. Well, yeah, if you're there for 6 months or 2 years, it's hard. So that changes things as well. Others?
I thought it was interesting, the kind of the educational and political leanings and the level of de-churching. Because like many of us, I was at the college, they kind of tended to drift away. And, this is saying opposite to us. And the same I always thought, Washington State, West Coast, one of the reasons that we were less churched was because we tend to be politically more liberal. And they're finding different things than what I always thought.
Yeah, that's a good point. The church isn't drawn down political lines. I find it interesting. This is when they get into what they call the granular aspects of their data and trying to analyze the ethical ethnic backgrounds and the income levels, and this is where it kind of like, I don't know if that gets a little too much detail for me sometimes, but our church is full of people from both sides of the aisle. So yeah, it's an inviting, we need to be an inviting environment, and I think his comment I didn't quite follow so much on when he was saying that we follow the truth and we forgot about the good. I lost a little bit of that train of thought that he was, so I guess I'm going to have to buy the book, which I have available on Sunday. Go ahead.
Just what the last two people were saying kind of made me, and with the education piece, maybe the de-churching has more to do with moving to college and less about the education piece of college. And when I think of now I lived at home when I went to college, so I was still connected to my home church. But when I moved to one of my first jobs far away, I didn't start attending church for a while. And part of it was figuring out my place in my new community, figuring out my job, trying to be an adult. And I remember when somebody brought me to their church, I was like, oh, gee, I wish I'd been doing this all year. But maybe that's part of it, is that moving piece.
Yeah, I think too, we're all developing ourselves in that age too. I've always thought that the university time, the 18 to 22, could be replaced, for a lot of people it is, with military. That period of time is where you sort of define yourself. You sort of figure out who you're going to be. And I think that some it drags on even longer than that. And I think faith is just an aspect of our lives that kind of has to fit into that who we are phase. So, yeah. Please go ahead.
the moving thing, for me, I was thinking the other week too, when we were talking about this, transition time. I remember years ago when I was coming here with my little ones, and I would watch people disappear in their empty nest years. And I would wonder, why aren't they here? And then, of course, I came to my empty nest years, and I figured out, oh, okay, they're visiting their kids, they're taking care of their parents. They're, all of these things. Any time of transition, when you would think we would be leaning in to church, things are tearing us away.
Right. Up here, Pete. Linda. No, up here. Linda, right here.
Well, I think that, I'm old enough to remember when you couldn't buy meat on Sunday and everything was closed. I wonder if maybe the transition in our lives where we've kind of lost Sunday in our lifetime. The kids are all, it's not a big deal that they all go have sports on Sunday. People work on Sunday. It seems like any kind of a store or anything is open on Sunday. So when one of the questions was, do I not find time to come? I think that the change in our lifestyle could have a lot to do with it too. When you say that there's that huge percentage that would come back to church, how many of those can't find the time or life has changed them?
True. Okay, Ethel May, go ahead.
My daughter and her husband have been doing some moving this last year, and they've been trying to decide, what church to go to and so forth. And because she was going to be taking some college classes, and they bought a duplex in a town close to part of town close to the college, and it's a new development area, so people were neighborly and met her, and so the next door neighbor met her and told about the next door neighbor and the next door. And then one day there was a knock at her door, and she opened, and there was a nice looking young man with a bottle of wine, and he was the choir director for the church down the street. There are more ways than one to get to church.
That's great.
Others?
That's great.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, I've been traveling a lot with my career, and one of the things that I did when I was east of the mountains and now in Elmo, when I'm there at the weekends, I'll go to the local Lutheran church, and it's great the first time you go and visit. Everybody spots you and runs up and wants to know what they can do for you, and then you go the second Sunday and you're old news. So I think it's really important for us to also dive in to find out what keeps people here. Because we can talk about why people are leaving, but why do people stay?
I think that's a killer question.
Yeah, that's a good question.
I think that's a really good question. I think one of the things Bill mentioned, I used to run this Alpha program, and part of that was, from my background, was a lot of head knowledge. It's sort of like defining things a scientific way, in a way, I guess. But it gave me confidence to speak my faith a little bit more. But we don't really have to do that. The invitation is there. But I think one of the points you made, which I think is really interesting, on Friday I actually was at a different church, and it's kind of uncomfortable. All of you, I don't mean this in a, like, go find another church. I just mean when you travel, if you haven't done it, and maybe not even a Lutheran church, but see what it's like for a new person to go to a new congregation, and what might be good or bad about that. We used to have people stand up and introduce themselves at church. And in the church I used to belong to, we lived in Salt Lake Tahoe for a long time, so we get people from all over the world. And it was just so interesting to me. It really wasn't about embarrassing. It was kind of let people know who you were so you can talk to them after service, but also just to hear where they're from was part of it. That was a conscious effort in this church to stop doing that because people don't want to be introduced. Some do. I don't mind, but a lot of people would just like to come in, sneak out. They just want to see what it's like. But for all of us, when we're talking about the de-churching and how do we get people back, some of this I come to the people that have no experience in church, but even those of us who've been in church for a long time, going to a new congregation, go do it sometime and see what it feels like. It's a new building. You're not sure. Somebody might bump you in the pew and say, move over. You're in my seat. Has that ever happened here? Oh, yeah, it has. So do that. Get a little uncomfortable with your faith and then see what it's like and what you might be able to do in our congregation the next time you see somebody or you're sitting next to somebody. Many of you are really good at leaning across the pew and saying, good morning, I haven't seen you before. So I think it's so simple and so difficult to come out of your comfort zone, smile at somebody and say, hey, welcome, and what are you about? So, anybody else? Other questions, comments? So, I don't have anything, and we've hit our 15 minutes, and service is going to be starting pretty soon. Thanks for chatting it up a little bit with me. Like I said, Bill's coming back. The books are available. I don't know. I think Bill's doing a great job of reviewing the book. But pray on this. I hope to see you in 2 weeks so we can kind of query Bill on anything else that he's got to finish it off and where this goes with our congregation. Thank you all very much. I think we do need to pick up some chairs. I don't know what the setup is, but enjoy the rest of the day. God's blessings to you.
It's about half as full as it was last year. That's what happened. It's like a, you don't get home for dinner at 7:30 at night. But I really need to do it, so that's how it is. Hi there. Hi, Mom. Sandy. Yeah. I see she's gone. She must have gone somewhere.